So the act of doing a still life is pretty simple. It's been done for a long time, and the basic concept is that we get a bunch of different materials, as many as you can find, especially things you're interested in, and we sort of put them on a table or somewhere where it's kind of easy to paint, where we have control of the light, or where the light is somewhat consistent. The best kind of light is probably natural light, but if you have something artificial, we're setting up a scenario where you can play with the light and learn about these different forms and materials. So let's take a look at a little bit of video footage and just sort of check how some of these things work and sort of what to look for when you are kind of setting this up and doing it. So the main idea is just go through your house and try and find a bunch of different things. Often you'll be surprised what there is, and just look for different materials that are interesting. Often things that are sort of like of a more quality will have a more sort of sturdy sort of build, and the materials will be a bit high quality. Look for that kind of thing as opposed to something sort of cheap. And then you kind of want something to control the ground plane, which is really going to influence sort of how much bounce light you have. So I think something bright is a good place to start. Again, just a white t-shirt, bit of clothing, and you use something more complicated later on if you kind of get bored of using white. But white will really let a lot of bounce light kind of come up from the white surface and hit your objects, which is kind of what we want, because it exaggerates the feeling of sort of bounce light, which is it's exaggerating it, makes it easier to see. So that's a good place to start. And it kind of also, makes it a bit easier to sort of play with composition and edges and those kind of things, and just kind of set a little scene. So I've got a white object. This is a plastic pumpkin. I recommend sort of real fruit is probably a better way to go. But also, again, if you're doing this at nighttime, try and get a lamp or something. I think I was using sort of just one of those, like a kind of bendable desk lamp, so I could kind of play with it, and you can sort of see what happens. We get sort of a much better read between light and dark. There I'm turning it off so you can see it's kind of more diffuse. We're still getting the same stuff happening, but here when I turn it on, you've got much more sort of direct light. And what you'll find is that although you can sort of paint something, and you'll see this when we do the still lifes in classroom, you can paint something with a sort of neutral light, but you're going to get something that's much more artistic, I guess, and interesting, and more dynamic if you can control the light source and play around with it a bit. And it's good to just be able to move the light source around and see what happens. So, there I'm kind of pointing out we've got that reflected light. Really pay attention to the reflected light going on with those objects, and kind of how it's affecting those different materials. Even though they're both plastic, just because they're different colors, it's affecting them differently. And this is kind of a reflective, highly reflective material, this kind of chrome sort of thing. It's pretty much a mirror. You can see me, you can see the camera, you can see everything. And this is obviously really good to study if you're interested in creating sort of mechanical, like automotive style designs, and understanding how reflections work, chrome, that sort of thing. It's good to be able to paint that. But also, more important than that is to understand that what's happening with the reflected light on all objects is very similar to what's happening to the reflected light on the actual, like mirror finish. It's very similar. It's just reflecting that sort of bright sort of object, the white t-shirt, and it's reflecting it up. But instead of it being kind of a mirror, it's a very much more diffuse aspect of that. So here we're just going to demonstrate that same concept again. So we've got a white surface. Remember this from the cubes. We've got a white surface and a black surface, and you can see that the white surface is reflecting to the bottom of that pumpkin, whereas the black surface is not. It is a little bit, but not to the same degree. We're many levels of magnitude higher in terms of the amount of light that's bouncing off that white t-shirt. And also you can see the shadow a lot better on the t-shirt. Whereas, you know, here, same sort of thing, but you can't really see the same level of bounce light. You can't really see the same level of shadow. So there's, to a certain degree, there's less to study, which is why, you know, a lighter material or something that will let you play around with that is good. And here you'll see, you know, like as I put sort of different things on in front of the camera, the sort of, you know, the way that light is going into the lens and affecting the exposure is kind of changing things. That's also important to pay attention to, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But photography is really limited, and obviously this is not the best camera I'm using. It's, you know, it's an old camera. It's not a terrible camera, but, you know, it's certainly not, you know, a really high end you know, digital SLR. It's not full frame. There's nothing like that going. It's a sort of lower end camera. And it's limited in how it can actually capture light, whereas your eye is, you know, one of the most sophisticated pieces of, you know, machinery in terms of capturing light. And it's especially good because it's good at capturing light in the same way that we see it. So a camera is always, you know, or even a really good camera is a good second in terms of being able to study and see different things, see different colors. So you can see here, again, even with this white object, it's not reflecting, again, as much as the chrome, but we can still see it's giving a little red aspect to that white little cup. And you can see, again, here, trying to get that concept to be really clear, is that here we're not seeing that same level of reflection, but you can still see that what's actually creating those different shapes on the capsicum, the, you know, plastic capsicum, is the environment. And as we move the white t-shirt further towards the capsicum, it's getting whiter, and you can actually see that it's sort of reflecting in the same way that this is, you know, the same way the chrome is. It's reflecting that shape, and as we move those things further and closer to the chrome, it's going to reflect in the same way as it's reflecting off the plastic through. So again, it's good to pay attention and move things around so you can just kind of get a feel for how reflections work, what's actually happening. So you can see there what was happening is that, you know, we were getting kind of a bit of a point light reflecting in this object. So you can see now what happens when I put it on a black surface. Again, it's not reflecting as much light. When I wave something around it, you can see that it is actually reflecting those things. And it's very subtle, but that's what makes up this kind of sophisticated material. So again, we put it on something white, and you can see it really kind of starts to pop. Again, where it kind of, the exposure is not really working on the camera, but you can sort of see how it works. There we go, move it around. So you can see the difference. Same object placed in different surroundings, it's going to light up in different ways. And that's basically what we're studying when it comes to doing all of this sort of still life stuff. So you can see, again, it's kind of reflecting as we move it around. It changes the shape, and the variety of that reflected light is sort of based on what's happening with the t-shirt there. So you can see, again, we've got a chrome ball, and that's reflecting completely. So notice the difference in the way that the chrome, like Christmas decoration, is reflecting this, you know, capsicum compared to that little sort of vase thing. So they're different levels of reflection. They're all reflecting it, but not to the same level. And a lot of it is to do with proximity, you know. So just pay attention to these things. When we get really close, it's kind of, it's blocking some of that reflected light. It's affecting the color on the vase a little bit, but it's not reflecting to the same degree. And everything's going to reflect and show that sort of reflection of, especially of lights, reflecting lights like sunlight or spotlights, artificial lights, is often what gives us that specular highlight, that sort of little hot spot, which really makes something look shiny, you know, like the light on these has that really kind of hot spot. So again, watch like the difference in reflections of these two materials. just due to the surface type, even though they're both kind of shiny, it's going to reflect differently. You know, you just can't see that level of reflection in the one on the left, but it is still reflecting tons of that white t-shirt. So it's reflecting some things, but not like a mirror. So we just take like a simple cup. It may seem kind of simple, but again, pay attention to what's going on and how it's being affected by reflected light. We've still got that quite a strong white reflection going on. So you can see again, we've got this red object moving around. That's going to sort of affect the reflected light. If we put it close by, you can see here we're sort of getting closer, and it's actually filling in the side of that with red. And these are things, again, that you probably won't notice, and you probably won't notice them quite as much in a photo. You know, the things here are kind of dulled down a bit. Whereas when you see them in real life, you can sort of pay more attention and see more color, basically. It sounds weird, but that's kind of how it works. So here we have like glass, and you can see not the same level of reflection. You know, glass isn't reflecting light in the same way. You know, it's just passing through it. So, you know, that's kind of how that works. That's good to know if you're, you know, painting glass or doing something like that. So again, here we got something which is kind of much more complicated, and it's got a metal. This is a real kind of metal. And it's reflecting some things, but it's a bit more sort of rusted up. So it's not going to reflect those things in the same way that, you know, full-on new chrome is going to do. And what you can see is that, again, the camera is having trouble capturing all of this information at the same time. It's really struggling. It's kind of bogging down. And that's kind of, even if you can adjust it and get a better sort of look happening, again, if I turn the light off, you can see we've sort of got... you know, we can sort of see more information, but we're not getting that sort of level of contrast. I'm sort of playing around with it, just in an attempt to sort of get a better sort of exposure on the camera, but also just so you can see sort of what's happening when I move the light around. So yeah, photography is always going to be sometimes a good, sometimes a bad interpretation of the light of what was going on. But when you look at an object, you can actually look at it more closely, and what you'll find is that you'll see more color detail the more that you look at something. And you look at it once and you'll kind of see, like, you'll see a certain amount of color information, but the more you kind of tune in and actually look closer, you can actually sort of, your eye will adjust and see different things dynamically. Whereas if you're just looking at a plain photo, it's not going to do that. You know, you're always looking at the same record of what's going on. But, you know, our eyes can adjust to, you know, like night, we have a certain degree of night vision, not as much as a cat or something like that, but we have a degree of night vision where we can see things in the dark once our eyes adjust. You know, so our eye is not static, and what we see is not static. It changes based on sort of what we're doing, and our brain interprets it. So, you know, what we're seeing is actually what's going on in our mind. So all these subtleties and these sort of simpler things that are going on, they all change when you actually view them in real life. So yeah, don't get confused with sort of studying photos and sort of thinking that it's the same thing. It's similar. You can certainly learn a lot from photography, and understand if you want something to look quote unquote photoreal, you can study photos. I think that's a really good way to understand how photos work and how to get that feel. But also understand that our eyes are much more sophisticated than that in many ways, and we can actually represent with paint things which can't be represented by photos. And if we are doing that, that's probably a good thing to do, because we're at an advantage. Again, you know, cameras will get better, and we might get to a point where this is not an issue, but certainly for the majority of photography, that's the case. And certainly when you're really studying subtle materials like this, it's good to sort of try and get as close to the subtlety as you can. You can see here the camera is having just real trouble understanding what's happening. So you see we turn off the light, And it's kind of, because it's dark, again, we don't have the best light here, but you can see that this camera is having trouble representing what's going on with that material, whereas when I see it, I can see all the detail in there. My eye adjusts to the ambient light, and, I can see pretty much, as much as I want in there. There's plenty of light for my eye. So I'm going to try and mess around with the lighting and sort of see whether I can get a better exposure happening. Again, it's just sort of happening on the fly, but it's very important to understand that painting from life is immensely valuable for these reasons. So let's look at a couple of other things, because again, materials are important, and studying cloth is actually a very good way to understand what's happening with like a certain material, because we can sort of fold it and it's got form. So you can see, again, just paying attention to how much that cloth is going to sort of reflect, or like what's happening. Basically, how does it change when it's got light on it versus when it's got shadow on it? So this is another type of velvet. They're both kind of, red velvet, but the way that the value changes is completely different when this is in light versus shadow. So yeah, very, very different thing happening, even though if you were to sort of say, I'll just paint it as red velvet, what kind of red velvet? They behave differently. One is maybe more like crushed velvet, and one's kind of really giving much more of a contrasty difference between the light and the shadow. Whereas the one on the left is a bit sort of smoother. One on the right is a lot harsher. It's a lot more sort of saturated. It's a lot more of a cool red. So yeah, pay attention to these things. This is kind of what you need to be doing when you're looking at the world, is kind of see what happens. So here we've got, a different sort of, these are just little scraps of material, just so you can sort of understand like what's happening with the values in all of these things as light hits it, different types of light hitting it. How does that change? So, you could have the same setup and it could just be a very simple setup. Again, just some cups with different sort of materials. Again, they could be materials you have. If you have like a woolen, something that's wool, like a woolen jacket, you can paint that versus like, maybe a sort of more plastic piece of clothing. Again, you can just paint that and you'll learn a lot, because because fabric really kind of twists and turns, and you can get a good feeling for how to represent something and how to block it out, just by considering, again, the difference between value and color in the light versus in the shadow. And you see a lot of these materials really sort of change in the way they light up based on, is the light kind of really hitting it directly, or is it hitting it kind of, a bit more on an angle, or is it, not hitting it at all? Those are kind of three different values. Whereas some things, again, like a matte cube that's gray, is just completely gradual. It doesn't change color, it doesn't change hue based on whether the light's hitting it, but some things do. So here you can sort of see this and what's happening here. So pay attention to, if you have patterns on a piece of material, kind of like how does that become affected when those two sort of colors go into the shadow? Do they go equally, or do some colors go differently? Again, this is where sort of painting a black cube and a white cube and understanding the difference in how the values sort of are handled in the darks will come in handy. We're not sort of just going, oh, it's in the shadow, so they both go down equally. They behave differently because some of those patterns are light, some are dark. So again, like the more complicated the scene and the more things that the camera sort of has to focus on and get right, the harder it's going to be for it to sort of make sure everything's exposed correctly. And the best way to sort of do like a still life is, again, just start with a single thing. Start with something like an orange, or like an apple, or orange is probably easier because it doesn't have a pattern. The apple kind of has a pattern. Start with something simple and just kind of paint that. Spend as much time on it as you kind of need, and get as close as you need. And then either add something or paint another thing. They don't always have to be a complex kind of pile of things on the table. I think that was much more a product of, again, like look at what's happening here, where we've got, just a bunch of little kind of highly reflective surfaces. But yeah, I think the old school still life, where you was kind of put a whole bunch on a table and set it up, was mostly because in that instance, probably the materials like the canvas and the paints were a bit more limited, a bit more expensive. So it was worth sort of making a thing of it. Whereas, when we've got digital tools, you can spend an hour just sort of doing something, and like you get out of it what you learn. We don't necessarily have to make it, a piece of art per se, although it's always good to consider the composition and all of those things. So again, like look at this sort of material. It's a bunch of sequins, and it's reflecting all the sequins are kind of pointing slightly different ways, and they're reflecting as a mirror. They're all little kind of mirrors. They're reflecting different colors. And again, this is sort of, to a degree, what happens with a material in general, is it's all reflecting those different colors. But obviously this one on the left is reflecting more. But, we can get materials that reflect even more than that. Like this one, which is kind of basically like a sort of, it's obviously not as clear of a mirror as the vase is, in the chrome vase, but it's kind of definitely on that scale of being sort of reflective. And so it's going to reflect what's going on around it a lot more. And basically all that's happening is it's just kind of reflecting different areas of the environment based on where it's sort of pointing. So again, good to just observe these things and sort of see what happens. But also, if you can sort of understand what happens in general with a material, you can begin to sort of start to suggest like the iconography of that material. Like what happens? Is it like really soft and smooth, or does it really change a lot of hue and saturation? Does it changes from light to dark, or is it reflective? Again, how is it reflective? As it's reflective, does it kind of push the contrast on the things it's reflecting? Because I think that's one of the things that happens here, is that the contrast is somewhat increased when things are being reflected. So yeah, the idea is just kind of, again, if you want something really complicated, just sort of put a bunch of things together, and you can think of it as composition, but also think of it as a way to increase the complexity of what is going to affect what, depending on where we go. And think about where you're kind of shoot it and what's going to happen, like how are things going to affect it. Is it going to be more interesting to put one thing next to another thing? Again, do you want white under it? Is that the kind of scenario you want? Do you want a different type of color? Because that will affect it too. Yeah, and so the more things you put in the scene, the more things you basically have to calculate and think about, the more interesting it becomes from a lighting scenario. And also, the more things you kind of have to make work together, because obviously, it's quite easy to paint one thing by itself, but the more things we put in there, the more you'll kind of notice that they all kind of need to match the same lighting. We've got sort of more ways that things can go wrong if we kind of misstate values. So yeah, it can be either simple or it can be easy, but the idea is to study materials and play around with the way that light interacts with these materials. This is really what it's about. Painting is mostly about painting light. So just moving things around, feel free to kind of, spend a bit of time doing this. If you are doing your still life, think about the composition, think about where you're going to sit. And just play around with it. What are the different effects? What do you want to study? What are you interested in? That's basically the goal. And another advantage of doing a still life versus photo is you can actually really get close and sort of understand these materials much better. You're not relying on kind of that interpretation and just that single interpretation. You can zoom in and try and understand actually what's going on there. And that will help you kind of paint it better, because you're actually understanding the material and what is actually happening in that material to create those values and those forms.